Paul McCartney has remained a well-known name in the entertainment industry because of his involvement with the Beatles. This was a group that he shared with the likes of John Lennon, with whom he also shared some turbulent relationships, as they disagreed on several issues. This rift had led to the end of the group, leading these legends into solo endeavors. However, Paul was pained when he heard about the tragic death of Lennon, causing him to regret the times that they were apart due to their disagreements. But one would wonder how everything started for these two. Well, join us as we take you through the life and struggles of Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney is probably one of the most iconic musicians ever to grace this world. He was born James Paul McCartney on June 18, 1942, in Liverpool, England, into a working-class family of James McCartney and Mary Patricia McCartney. His father was a cotton salesman, a pianist, and an amateur jazz player who laid a great deal of Paul's early foundation in music. His mother, Mary, was a midwife who provided health care for pregnant women. Tragedy happened when his mother, Mary, died of an embolism after a mastectomy in 1956, when Paul was only 14 years old. The incident was really traumatic for Paul and shaped much of his songwriting, including hits like Let It Be. His initial education was at the Stockton Wood Road Primary School, followed by studies at Joseph Williams Junior School. He was an intelligent child, an avid reader of literature, and a brilliant student of art. In 1953, he sat for and cleared the 11+ examination that made him qualified for a place in the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. It was at this school that Paul developed an immense love for music and writing. It was at this school that Paul met George Harrison, who became his future bandmate with the Beatles. Paul was good academically, but had a particular fascination with creative pursuits like art and music, and thus would often write poetry and sketch. Jim McCartney was a very sensitive father who encouraged his son's musical inclinations and gave him his first instrument, a trumpet, on his 14th birthday. However, he soon switched to guitar because he realized it would allow him to sing and play at the same time. His father's influence as a pianist also helped him develop a love for melodies and harmonies that would become a hallmark of his songwriting. Paul's interest in music grew in the post-war period when British teenagers first started listening to American rock and roll. He had been influenced by the voices of Little Richard, Elvis Presley, and Buddy Holly. In 1957, at a church function, Paul met John Lennon, and thus began an instant rapport between two lovers of music, eventually leading to the founding of what would later be known as the Beatles. Paul's father brought exposure to music into his life, and his mother gave him a nurturing spirit, both combining to form the base for sensitivity and versatility that became characteristic of his career. Through his education and early influences, Paul McCartney was taught and encouraged to develop the skills and passion that would ultimately set him up as the centerpiece of one of history's most influential bands. The most traumatic event in his childhood was when his mother, Mary McCartney, died of an embolism after surgery for breast cancer in 1956. For the then 14-year-old Paul, the event was a sudden and life-shattering incident. His mother had been a strong pillar in their family, and her death really stirred Paul's emotions and creativity. He later poured all this grief into songwriting, and this can be most noticed in the song Let It Be by the Beatles, as he refers to his mother with the famous lines, "When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me." In July 1957, Paul met John Lennon at the Woolton Parish Church Fete in Liverpool. John was performing with his band, the Quarrymen, a group that plays both traditional folk music and early rock and roll. Paul was just 15 then and was introduced to John by a mutual friend, Ivan Vaughan. When he was introduced to John, he immediately clicked with him, not only over his musical talent, but also over that little bit of rebellious charisma. Following John's performance, Paul took to the guitar and began playing a version of Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock. He had John in a spell. Within a week, John asked him to join the Quarrymen. Their collaboration hit off almost immediately as Paul and John found themselves in songwriting with some sort of unique chemistry. They soon started penning tunes together, often meeting at each other's homes and churning out what was to become the hallmark Lennon-McCartney songwriting combination. Beginning with covers of their favorite rock and roll hits, they soon found themselves writing original material. These early songs laid the bedrock for what became the legendary repertoire of the Beatles. Over time, Quarrymen admitted new group members, among them George Harrison, an acquaintance of Paul's from school. George's aptitude for the guitar and his interest in American rock made him an overnight sensation among his bandmates. By the end of some time, the Quarrymen morphed into a rock band. By 1960, for instance, the name had at last been officially altered to the Beatles. The early years were filled with struggle as they often played in small clubs, most notably in Hamburg, Germany, where they would go playing for hours in dingy conditions. These experiences sharpened their musical skills and built their camaraderie. The Beatles' lineup was finalized with the addition of drummer Ringo Starr in 1962. The band was then starting to gain a local following in Liverpool and beyond. The writing skills of Paul and John were still in the embryonic stage when their talents caught the eye of manager Brian Epstein, who would prove instrumental in securing the group's first record deal. Love Me Do was among the early chart successes that launched them on the road to international fame and turned Paul and his group members into legends in the music world. However, they soon started getting caught in the series of rumors usually seen about celebrities. Along the line, there came the claim that Paul McCartney died in a car accident in 1966 and was quietly replaced by a look-alike. Emerging first in the late 1960s, this urban legend has continued to enthrall fans and conspiracy theorists to this day. The rumor started in 1969 when a Detroit college student phoned a local radio show with a theory that Paul McCartney died in a car crash in 1966. According to the theory, the Beatles and their management decided to hush up Paul's death to the public to avoid traumatizing their fan base. They were supposedly replacing him with one William Campbell, a talented musician who had undergone plastic surgery to look just like Paul. As if that wasn't enough, to further this theory, some believed the Beatles had left subtle clues in their albums, hinting to Paul's death, and it almost seemed like the band was attempting to covertly communicate the truth with the public. One of the most famous so-called clues is on the cover of Abbey Road. The picture of the band crossing the street was said by fans to represent a funeral procession. John Lennon in white is a priest, Ringo Starr in black is a mourner, George Harrison in denim is a gravedigger, and Paul, who is barefoot and out of step with the others, is the corpse. The fact that Paul, known to be left-handed, was holding a cigarette in his right hand added fuel to the fire, as some fans felt this proved that the man on the cover wasn't really Paul. Despite all these speculations, the Beatles repeatedly denied the rumor. Most especially, it was absurd and irritating for Paul McCartney. He was asked about the claim during an interview with Life magazine in 1969, and he said, "Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. However, if I were dead, I would be the last to know." Eventually, the Paul is dead conspiracy faded away, but not before leaving its mark on popular culture. Some fans still enjoy listening for hidden clues in Beatles songs and albums, but most consider the rumor a quaint artifact of rock history, a testament to the band's cultural influence rather than to any real mystery. To Paul McCartney, the rumor simply added one more layer of intrigue to his already fabled career, making him almost a figure of myth while still alive. However, the death of their manager, Brian Epstein, in 1967 marked the beginning of internal strife and, ultimately, the breakup of the band. He is one of the so-called fifth Beatles, who managed, directed, and harnessed the talents of the Beatles from almost complete obscurity into musical superstardom. Epstein engaged in business dealings for the Beatles, ran tours, and held the band together. His sudden death by drug overdose found the band at a confusing crossroads when concealed tensions between band members had been getting worse and worse. Without Epstein to exert a moderating influence, the Beatles could not work their way through the pressures of fame, business decisions, and creative differences that were tearing them apart. After Epstein's death, the Beatles attempted self-management, but all that came out of attempts to fill the void in management were disagreements. The group retained Alan Klein for the business side, but Paul McCartney didn't trust him and wanted to use his father-in-law, Lee Eastman. This disagreement on management made things worse, and the band members, and more importantly, Paul and John Lennon, grew much farther apart. By 1969, the tensions within the band finally came to a head. John Lennon, with interest in his solo work and his personal relationship with Yoko Ono at an all-time high, bowed out of the group. In a private meeting, Lennon said as early as September of 1969 that he was quitting the Beatles. This news, however, the group agreed not to make it public for the time being, partly because business negotiations were still going on. All the same, the exit of Lennon symbolized the end of the group, since by then their personal and creative differences could not be reconciled. Without the manager to lead them, and with Lennon deciding to leave, the group found it hard to keep together anymore. They had already talked about solo projects in which each one would be working on their projects independently. George Harrison felt he was standing in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney's songwriting dominance. He began working on his solo material. Ringo Starr, too, started considering life outside the Beatles. This cumulative dysfunction finally got on Paul McCartney's nerves. He felt it was time to take matters into his own hands. In April 1970, he made his public announcement about having left the Beatles with a solo interview accompanying his first solo album, McCartney. Above all, Paul's decision to quit was dictated by the band's internal fights, his dissatisfaction with how the band was managed at that moment, and his need for creative freedom. Paul's first solo album, McCartney, was recorded secretly and was a very personal effort. The album reflected his potential to act as a multi-instrumentalist. He could himself play each instrument on this album. It received mixed reviews upon its original release, but performed well commercially, reaching the #1 spot on Billboard's United States charts. His second album, Ram, in 1971, was jointly credited with Paul and his wife, Linda McCartney, and was also critically acclaimed for securing his solo career. Starting the band Wings in 1971, he found quite a bit of success throughout the 1970s with hits including Band on the Run and Live and Let Die. His solo career was one that proved, without the Beatles, that Paul McCartney was still one of the most influential and successful musicians in the world. After his exit from the Beatles in 1970, Paul McCartney formed Wings in 1971 with his wife Linda McCartney, guitarist Denny Laine, and drummer Denny Sewell. But it wasn't easy to get Wings flying. Not quite the same as the overnight success that Paul found with the Beatles. This one was a little slower starter. Early performances for Wings were in small venues and unadvertised, their audiences unfamiliar with the new material. McCartney made it a conscious point not to cash in on his fame with the Beatles, not even playing Beatles songs at these concerts, wanting Wings to make it on their own merits. The first album, Wildlife, had mixed reviews and fairly modest commercial success. This album, upon its release, was panned by critics, but there were those fans who expected more from McCartney after his Beatles heyday. Despite this, Paul remained determined to make Wings a relevant and successful band. Wings started to catch hold with the release of their second album, Red Rose Speedway, in 1973, which contained the hit single, My Love. The song topped the U.S. charts and cemented Wings as a respectable act. Their big break came in later that same year when Band on the Run was released, a commercial and critical success. Despite the deplorable recording conditions, the album was an instant commercial success with hits such as the title track Band on the Run and Jet. The album reached the top spot in both the US and the UK, and the group received several awards with the album, including a 1975 Grammy Award for Best Pop Vocal Performance by a Duo, Group, or Chorus. Wings continued to rise in popularity through the 1970s, with successful albums and hit singles reigning at the top of the charts. Their 1975 album Venus and Mars included the single Listen to What the Man Said, which hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. In 1976, Wings embarked on the phenomenally successful Wings Over the World tour, finally taking them onto a mass audience, sealing their reputation as a concert draw. Although audiences had continuously demanded Beatles songs, McCartney resisted and tried to keep Wings' identity separate from his own. Wings continued their fast rise with Wings at the Speed of Sound in 1976, featuring hits such as Silly Love Songs and Let 'Em In. Silly Love Songs was one of McCartney's most iconic post-Beatles hits, reaching the top of the charts and obtaining positive critical reception. Further testament to their live abilities, their live album Wings Over America in 1976 depicted the growth and popularity of the band. Over the years, Wings accumulated a variety of awards, many Grammy nominations, as well as a couple of wins. These contributions to rock music did take off, both commercially and critically, despite the early humps. In the end, Wings did break up in 1981, but then again, by this time they had already attained huge success. That Paul refused to rest on Beatles songs in Wings concerts says much for his dedication and commitment to establishing the identity of the band. Whereas the fans were yearning for some sort of nostalgia, Paul was out to go ahead with creative tasks. Sooner or later, his persistence paid off, and Wings emerged as one of the most successful bands of the 1970s, putting him immediately back into the ranks of musical icons. At least these successes lightened the heat from his strained relationship with Lennon. Once two close friends and songwriting partners by the time the White Album was in production, the dynamic between them was changed. Lennon's growing relationship with Yoko Ono and the leadership role that McCartney had taken on, especially after their manager Brian Epstein died, caused tension. At times, Lennon would clash with Paul's perfectionism in the studio, as he liked to be more experimental and free-spirited, which caused a noticeable rift. This tension could not be better epitomized than in the recording of Let It Be in 1969. The band's sessions were infamous for the strain that would result in frequent arguments between its members. These sessions finally frustrated him, as McCartney's attempts to hold the band together and his bossy attitude got on his nerves. Feeling stifled, Lennon then began to publicly criticize McCartney's work, questioning his right to leadership. There were no more private disagreements, but these issues between them started to show to the fans and the media alike as a growing rift between them. During this period, most interviews given by band members hinted at a problem within the band, and their public appearances betrayed the emotional distance between Paul and John. When in 1970 Paul announced he was leaving the Beatles, it indeed seemed that his relationship with Lennon was irreconcilable. Most acrimonious of all was Lennon, who sensed Paul had made the announcement too quickly, and he and the others should have taken ownership of the story of the band. This set off a public exchange of barbs, with Lennon venting to interviewers, and even in his songs like How Do You Sleep? From Lennon's 1971 album Imagine, which was a vicious attack on McCartney, full of personal insults, despite the bitterness and public feud, time allowed the wounds to heal. As the years went by, both Lennon and McCartney started to soften towards each other. They stopped the public criticisms. Although they did slowly rebuild their friendship, it never was as close as during their Beatles years. In the mid-1970s, they even spent some time together when McCartney visited Lennon in New York City, and there were even rumors of a possible musical collaboration. By the time of Lennon's tragic death in 1980, the two had somewhat reconciled. Though a complicated and often intensely conflicted relationship, both Paul and John finally found acceptance in one another. Their legacies with the Beatles, something to be cherished by each other. We hope this video has been insightful, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.